What's up, everybody? It's your boy, Sad Nixon, and I'm coming at you today with a Secret Hitler tournament video for Tournament 11. And it's been a little bit since I've had one of these videos, but I thought I'd get right back at it because people have been reminding me that it was a cool feature. So, I'm going to do a draft analysis of this tournament's draft. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few different metrics that we have that are available to us to basically measure player skill. And we're going to compare that with the results, and we're going to find out which things are perhaps most predictive, which people overperformed their draft by the most and the least, and some other cool information. All right, so let's get started. I want to show you my different metrics that I have, and I have a few different metrics, which are all kind of interesting in their own way. So on the Secret Hitler site, of course, we have the ELO system, which is a great way of measuring skill. And unfortunately, that system was reset at some point. And after the reset, not every player who generally plays in tourney has played all that much. So some players, their current ELO is not super reflective probably of their skill because they haven't played enough in recent times. However, we still can find on their profiles a statistic for the ELO that they used to have, that they had when the reset actually happened. So we have a reset ELO for that. We also have a maximum ELO, which is the stat that basically measures the max ELO that a player has reached since the reset. We have the current ELO, which is exactly what it says, it's the current ELO. And we have the overall maximum ELO, which is a stat that I've calculated, which basically takes the maximum of all three of the previous ELO stats that I've mentioned, and it just takes the maximum of those. And I thought that might be an interesting way to kind of combine the measurements from pre-reset and post-reset to see if that has any predictive power. And then the final metric that we have is the Glicko metric. Now, this is something of my own invention. The Glicko system isn't, but this particular incarnation is, and it basically measures skill based only on past tournament results for each player. Now, unlike ELO, this starts at 1500 instead of 1600, and also unlike ELO, the Glicko system actually has two numbers for each player. There's a Glicko number, which measures skill, and an RD number, which is basically like a standard deviation, which tells you essentially how sure the system is of a player's skill, with the lower RD being more sure. So let's first of all take a look at the reset ELO. Now we can see here basically the top 5 and the bottom 5 players based on pre-reset ELO at the time of reset. And the top player is Carl, followed by the Gestapo Andrew, both with very impressive ELOs of 2200 and 2120. And we can see at the bottom we have Anna and Debach, which are over around the 1500 level. So unfortunate for them, but that's just the way it goes. So that is our pre-reset ELO. That of course excludes any player that didn't have a pre-reset ELO, of which there are some. There are some players that started after the reset. But this next stat does include every player, technically, which is the maximum ELO. So regular max ELO, it just measures exactly what it says, the maximum ELO since the reset. The top player for that is actually Pingu with 2162, followed by Hemi with 2124. And then at the bottom we have players like Andrew, Skinny Josh, Iconic, and Pandemania. And we see 1600 for all of them because it's actually impossible for the stat to be lower than 1600. Every player started at 1600 after the reset, so your maximum has to be at least that. And unfortunately, some people's ELOs have only gone down, and some people haven't played at all. But that's just the way that goes as well. So let's take a look next at the current ELO stat. So this shows you the top players by current ELO, post-reset ELO. Again, we have Pingu at the top with 2071, followed by Medusa with 2005. We also have other active players like Skate, Jake, Smoke and Barbecue, and Maximovic, who are way up there. And at the bottom, unfortunately, we have players such as Pandemania, King Brucey and Higgler, which are all around the 1500 range currently. Sad for them. So moving right along, we have our final ELO-based stat, which is the overall maximum ELO, which, like I said, takes the maximum of the previous 3 stats. And that kind of combines pre-reset and post-reset ELO. It doesn't actually show you the true maximum ELO that an account has ever had, because we don't have the stat for maximum ELO pre-reset. We only have the stat for at reset. But in any case, again, the highest player on this ranking is Carl, followed by Pingu, and at the bottom we have Pandemania, whose overall max is only 1600. Now, one more stat. Let's look at the Glicko stat. So for Glicko, this is based on past tourney performance. The highest player is actually Prince Perry with 1852. Remember, this starts at 1500 average, not 1600. So that's pretty high. And then we have Pingu, probably regarded as one of the best tourney players ever, or the best, just a bit under, 2 points under at 1839. At the bottom, we actually have Jake Smoke and Barbecue, which is interesting because his maximum ELO and current ELO is actually really high, but his tourney performance has not been up to that par, and so his Glicko is actually as low as 1193, which is pretty low. And we notice the RD numbers by the side of all these. So these top players have a pretty low RD in the hundreds range. The RD can get to a maximum of 350. Unfortunately, in the hundreds is actually still pretty high for this, but we just don't have a big sample size for tournament games. So that's the way that is. So what I've done is I've taken each of these stats, ELO, max ELO, current ELO, overall max ELO, Glicko, and I've calculated each player's ranking in those stats within the tournament, and I'm going to show you some things based on that, and also show you some things based on the comparison of the ranking of players by how many points they got in tourney, and that basically that compared to their order in which they're drafted. Now this, that metric doesn't apply for captains because they weren't drafted. But for Pingu, you see his draft order is number 1. He was drafted first. And we can see, if we scroll over here, that his points order is 3. So among players who were drafted, he got the 3rd most points. So let's check out stats on that. So first of all, we're going to check out the stats which show us the players that have the lowest diff number. Now, what diff is it's the points order, so the ranking that they got in terms of points, minus the draft order. So a lower number means the player overperformed by more. And we can see here at the very top of the chart is PRZA, who was drafted 71st, tied for 71st. That's in the last round. But in terms of points, he was 23rd among drafted players, with a total amount of points of 9 out of 4 games. And that gives him a diff number of minus 48, which is a pretty big diff. So he outperformed his draft by a whole lot, we're going to say. Now, if you ask me, I think that should make him dark horse, but we'll see what happens on that. Also up here, very high, are players like Moom, Kangaroo, King Brucey, Dr. 3, another last round pick, and all these players got pretty high, between the 10s and the 40s in terms of points order. And so they outperformed their draft position by between 31 and 36 placements, essentially. Including a 14-point performance. That's a huge performance from Moom. Now, she was kind of a mid-level drafted at 48, but that's still a big overperformance of 36. And let's just see some other overperforming players. Yeah, so lots of good turning performances we're seeing right here. So let's also check to see which players were kind of, let's say, correctly drafted. They performed right at their draft level. Their points ranking is very similar to their draft ranking. So right at the middle, we'll actually see that we have myself, Sad Nixon. I was drafted 55th, and in terms of points, I was the 55th ranking player among drafted players. So that gives me a diff of 0. So great drafting skills, just drafted me really perfectly in there. Other players near the middle of the road include Omich, Fishy, Hemi, Schuler, and Mosby as well. These players all have a diff of 0, so they were drafted right around where they should be, really. We also see some other high picks, such as Pingu and Maxi, who were drafted very high and performed at a very high level as well. So yeah, these are the mid-level players in terms of the diff ranking. And now let's see the players who sadly underperformed by the most. Unfortunately, at the very top, we do have Carl, who was drafted 10th and unfortunately got 0 points in this tourney, despite playing 4 games, which puts him 75th in terms of points scored. And this does give him a diff of 65, positive 65, which is pretty high. Other underperforming players, unfortunately, include Beyond 2, the Me Man, Zach on Crack, Desi, Not a Prince Perry. We can see some other ones on this list. Now, these are not bad players by any means. A lot of good players are actually on this list. It just didn't work out for them in this tourney, is what I'm going to say. All right, so now that we've seen that underperformance, overperformance, interesting information, let's move on. Let's see some graphs and some correlations. Okay, so this graph kind of shows us, if we put the draft order on one axis and the points that players got on the other axis, what would we see? And I've highlighted some outliers here. So we can see that there's a pretty good line going on. I would say a pretty clear, just visual correlation based on this. So, generally the order that people get drafted in, it's pretty reflective of how many points they're going to get. Now, of course, there's some correlation, causation stuff going on in there. If you're drafted high, you're likely to get more games, but, just interesting to see. Now let's look instead at if we saw this graph based on the overall maximum ELO, which I think is an interesting stat, and we also see a bit of an upward slope here, although it's a little bit noisier, for sure. But you can definitely see kind of a correlation here. I'm saying upward slope. Really, it's a downward slope because a lower maximum ELO order is better. But you know what I mean. And let's also look for a second at the Glicko order. Oh boy. So this is even a little bit more kind of seemingly all over the place, although perhaps a little bit of method to the madness going on, a little bit of a slope going on, a little bit of a correlation. Okay. So having looked at those graphs, I think that was a little bit interesting. Let's actually look at the correlations to see, of these skill metrics, which one had the best predictive power for how well a player was going to do in this tourney. Let's see how significant those results were. Okay, so I have here some R values and P values. So this is showing kind of strength of correlation. For each of our different metrics, we have reset ELO order, max ELO order, current ELO order, overall max ELO order, Glicko order, and draft order also on here. And this is correlating this with the points scored. So we see here, and by the way, negative correlation is going to be, the more negative the better in this case, because a low order should be correlated with a high point scored. So we have here, this is actually a pretty good correlation, and this is only considering players that actually have a reset ELO, so players that existed when the reset happened, but we have a correlation of 0.43 or negative 0.43 between that and the points scored, with a pretty low p-value. So this would indicate some significance for sure, which we would expect. So this suggests that perhaps 43% of a player's performance could be explained by their ELO from before the reset for players that have that statistic. For maximum ELO, since the reset, we have a little bit of a lower correlation with lower significance of only 0.23. For the current ELO, we see similar numbers with 0.22 with a 0.04 p-value. But for overall maximum ELO, so this is combining the reset ELO with the current ELO and basically taking the maximum of these. We have a correlation of 0.37 with a pretty low p-value. So, it turns out to be a pretty good metric, all things considered. It's kind of a crude method of combining pre and post reset ELO, but apparently it does work decently, although not as good as the pre-reset ELO for the players that do have that. For the Glicko correlation with points, we do unfortunately only have a 0.18, so it looks like past tourney performance can only explain, maybe 0.18, 18% of current performance, and that p-value is looking a little bit high. So this might not actually be a significant result. It does get a little bit better if we constrict it to only players that have an RD of less than 200. So this is players where the Glicko measurement is pretty sure of their ranking, and we have a slightly higher correlation of 0.22 with a slightly lower p-value of 0.07, but maybe still not that significant and not as good as looking at the pre-reset ELO or even the maximum post-reset ELO, I would say. So, shows a bit of a weakness in the Glicko system, although I think having that uncertainty in there is still good for some purposes, such as the tournament odds calculation. Okay, and finally, we can see the correlation between draft order and points scored is really quite big, 0.59, almost 0.6. So, yeah, 60% of the points that a player is going to score can be explained by their draft position. And this is scientific notation. This is showing a really, really low p-value. So this is very significant. Of course, as I said, the placement that a player gets drafted is really going to influence how many games a player is going to get, and thus how many points they're going to score. So we would expect this to be a high correlation. But this does tell us that, captains have a pretty good idea of which players are good and bad. And so the players that they pick in the order that they do, it kind of reflects very much how many points those players are going to score. So that's great. That's great to see. Yeah, this is showing some kind of mean values per team. Unfortunately, some of these are a bit messed up by the fact that some players don't have these statistics, but we can see here that in terms of the overall maximum ELO statistic, which every single player has that, the team with the highest one is actually the Single females with 1858. It's pretty high. And the team with the lowest is 1771 for Chorkaholics Anonymous, who did not perform very well in the tournament. So maybe we can see a bit of that correlation in there. Now for Glicko, the highest Glicko team on average turns out to be JN Element, who did not win, but they did come very close to winning the tournament. So that's that's also interesting to see. Yeah. Very cool. Okay, so now let's look at some charts. I just have some final charts before I go to show you the distribution of some of these metrics. So for the personal scores for players in the tourney, we can see this is the distribution. So yeah, decent amount of close to zero or at zero, and we have a bit of a kind of clump towards this side distribution. And then it goes off. That's what you would expect, I think. This is kind of a funny one. This is showing reset ELOs, and we can see kind of what we we might expect around this area. But around here, oh boy, this is a little bit weird. And I think what we see here is players camping at 2K before the reset in order to get that 2K elo solidified in history. So good job, campers. You really made your mark on this chart. Yeah, and for maximum elo, we see a big clumpage around 1600 because that's kind of the default value for this one. And then kind of a gradual downward slope, just like that. For current elo, we see perhaps a little bit better of an idea of how an elo curve should look, although we see a lot more from the high end than the low end. This is probably due to self-selection factors. A player with a really low elo might not enter tournament, unfortunately, or a player with a really low elo might just quit the site or switch to a different account. So we see a little bit of that effect going on in here. And then for the overall maximum elo, we see this kind of distribution, which is definitely very affected by those campers at 2K from before the reset. So there you go on that. And this is showing the Glicko distribution, which is a little bit more balanced, I would say, because it's a bit harder to kind of have a self-selection, because most players who play tourney do come back to play tourney again. There's a little bit of a spike here in the middle because any players who are new to tourney will generally be given a 1500 Glicko to start out with. So with maximum RD, maximum uncertainty. So there's a bunch of players clumped up in here. But yeah, this is showing a big smooth distribution, kind of, just like that. And finally, we have the distribution of the differences between points order and draft order. So yeah, kind of a nice distribution on that as well. Look at that. You know, just fun to look at. Finally, I always do, when I do these videos, I do an analysis of how did the trades go? Did the trades work out? Who did they benefit? Did they change standings? And it turns out that for this tourney, the trades did not change the standings at all. If I'm looking at this correctly, the placements, if the drafts had not happened, which we could see up here, would be the exact same as the final placements with the trades having happened. Okay. Now, it would have made things definitely better for some teams. JN Element did miss out on some points by doing the trade that they did, as well as $5 ice cream, with the benefit going to Single Females and Shorkaholics, but it wasn't enough to change any standings. So no big regret on those trades for sure. Although I will say that in terms of the player who most overperformed, if we go back, if I remember this correctly, we do see that it's a player that got traded from $5 ice cream to Single Females. So that was perhaps a big steal for Single Females for PRZA. So good job to PRZA for being the best, most overperforming tourney player, in my opinion, the dark horse. That's about all I got in terms of draft analysis. So I will see you next time. Once again, it's your boy, Sad Nixon, Secret Hitler, signing off.